And a lot of times that doesn't just take the shape of you don't know what critical race theory is, and this is where it's very important. These linguistic manipulations they use to do these things, whether it's calling you an ist that doesn't apply with a specialized definition, or whether it's you don't even know what this word means accurately because it uses a specialized definition, rely on using specialized definitions with political overlays that you don't realize. A friend of mine has written a book that I'm happy to be publishing for him through my company, New Discourses, soon, called Counter Woke Craft. It's for fighting woke in the university specifically. He's a professor. And he calls these crossover terms, woke crossover terms. Some common ones, they have multiple definitions, one specialist, one not. And some popular ones would include diversity. Diversity, obviously, in everyday parlance means that we have differences. Diversity is defined in, say, critical social justice or critical race theory only through the lens of structural power, such that you are diverse if you have a structurally determined different perspective. In other words, if you have a critical consciousness of your identity. So what that means is we now need people who are maybe white, but definitely other racial minorities. We need blacks, we need Hispanics, we need Asians and whatever. We need gays, we need trans, we need all of the sexual minorities. We need all the, I guess there are like 200. We're gonna need a lot of genders. We're going to need some very overweight people, so we're not fat phobic. We're going to need some disabled people, so we're neither ableist nor disableist. We need all of these people, but they happen to all have exactly the same view of their particular social location, which they call positionality. And that view is the critical consciousness of it, which is a very narrow understanding of what that means to be black or what that means to be gay. It's a very narrow, specific, politically intense meaning. So diversity actually means people who look different, who all have identical politics. And in fact, it's not even just identical politics. They're all critical theorists. Every single one of them. If you are not, you're not a formally trained expert in diversity any longer. Therefore, you are not diverse. I have a Indian immigrant friend who's a doctor who was told at a conference that he's the wrong kind of diversity now, for example, because he bucks the narrative. And I guess brown is the new race. I don't know exactly which race brown is, but he's not, as Ayanna Pressley said it, he's not a brown face that also wants to be a brown voice. She said that we don't need brown faces who don't want to be brown voices. We don't need black faces who don't want to be black voices. What that means is that they have a structurally determined unique voice of color that is what critical race theory says their experience in the world is. And if you don't have that, you're not genuinely diverse. So you're not actually part of diversity. It doesn't actually have anything to do with real difference of perspective or opinion. Inclusion means exclusion. Exclusion of everything that might make somebody who's in a protected category feel uncomfortable, according to some inclusion officer who might decide that for them on their behalf, even if they're not there or even if they weren't offended by it. Hence the microaggression and subjectivity. Equity. Equity is not equality. The actual definition of equity stems back to the 60s. Equity is defined this way. It says where equality is, this is by H. George Fredrickson, if you want to look him up. He says where equality means citizens A and B are equal. Equity means adjusting shares such that citizens A and B are made equal. And as I said before, equity is the equivalent of socialism on the way to justice, which is the equivalent of communism. So when you hear social justice, it's social communism. It will be achieved by enforcing social equity, which is what H. George Fredrickson called his theory, until it becomes automatic. So those words are common enough. Let me give you one. I'm going to read one to you. This is the definition of race in critical race theory. You think you know what race is, right? It is this is from the Brandeis University website, it is a misleading and deceptively appealing classification of human beings created by white people originally from Europe, which assigns human worth and social status using the white racial identity as the archetype of humanity for the purpose of creating and maintaining privilege, power, and systems of oppression. That's what they mean by race. That's what I'm talking about, though. There's these double meanings. Critical race theory, all three words are fake. We just heard what they mean by race, the easy word. Critical doesn't mean critical like critical thinking. They have papers and papers and papers explaining that there's a clear difference between the critical thinking tradition of Western philosophy and the critical theory tradition rooted in neo-Marxism that is interested in studying this, what is at the end of this, privilege, power, and systems of oppression. Critical means critical Marxist. It means taking the neo-Marxist perspective on how you're going to analyze the stratification of society across these lines of power, whether they're race, gender, or even class, sort of. They're not that interested in class any longer. Ableism, fat status, whatever. Theory means Marxian theory, means Marxist social theory, where the point is no longer simply to understand society, but to change it. Why would I say that? Why on earth would I invoke Marx directly? Well, here's the end of the second paragraph of Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension that not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. Second paragraph of the Critical Race Theory book written for high school students, because it's not in schools, back in 2001, happens to paraphrase Marx. Second paragraph in a section titled, What is Critical Race Theory? It's race Marxism. It's a very simple thing to understand. So this discernment with the language is very important. Let me give you one more, social justice. Social justice. This is a fun little piece. It shocks people a little bit. To clarify our definition, let's start with the concept of social justice. This is from Robin DiAngelo and Aslam Sensoy, writing in a 2012 education manual called Is Everyone Really Equal? Spoiler alert. They don't think so. While some scholars and activists prefer to use the term social justice in order to reclaim its true commitments, in this book we prefer the term critical social justice. So what they're telling you is that the social justice movement is in fact a very broad thing. So if there are any people out there listening to this, or that you know some that you might deal with who think that they just want to care about fairness and equality in the world, right? And they do care about issues of social justice, and good for them. That what we're dealing with the woke or critical social justice movement is one very narrow, very specific way of thinking about that problem, which has a number of fun parameters to it. A critical approach to social justice refers to a specific theoretical perspective that recognizes that society is stratified, that is, divided and unequal, in significant and far-reaching ways along social group lines that include race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Critical social justice recognizes inequality as deeply embedded in the fabric of society, i.e. as structural, and actively seeks to change this. Later in the book, they say it is always the responsibility of somebody who has privilege to attempt to interrupt systems of oppression. It has a number of very interesting properties. I won't read all of these, but the last two are a bit shocking, given that, you know, it's supposed to be caring about equality and fairness in society. Those who claim to be for social justice must be engaged in self-reflection about their own socialization into these groups, their so-called positionality, and must strategically act from that awareness in ways that challenge social injustice. So you didn't know that you were signing up for a program. And this action requires a commitment, I kid you not, to an ongoing and lifelong process. She also, Robin DiAngelo says elsewhere, no one is ever done. No end. Why? Because it's Marxism posing as justice. So this is what you're actually dealing with. Critical social justice is what they mean when they say social justice, which is a very narrow way to approach social justice. Race means some kind of power dynamic invented by white people to ruin everything, that holds themselves up as glorious and hates everybody else. All of their words, diversity, equity, inclusion, racism, anti-racism, means that you are a critical race theorist. That's all it means. What does it mean to be an anti-racist? I could have saved Ibram Kendi an entire freaking book. It means be a critical race theorist. How to be an anti-racist? Be a critical race theorist. Or you can read, like we had alluded to on page 19 of his book, where he says the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. So in other words, to be an anti-racist or a critical race theorist, you must also embrace discrimination.